listen to and talk to and enjoy. And tonight we have Brennert here with us. We're so excited. And I get to give a few words of introduction to him. I think many of you are probably very familiar with him. He was born in New Jersey area and grew up there in the towns of Palisades and Palisades Park. But he has lived here in Southern California since 1973. So in addition to his novels, or even before he wrote his novels, he wrote short stories, and he's written quite extensively for television and won an Emmy and several other awards, probably that might even be even more important than an Emmy for those who are in the business. He's developed major screenplays for studios and miniseries and pilots, and done all sorts of writing for show business. But then at one point, I read in one interview, he said that he wanted to write something that more people would see, for sure, because some of these things don't get produced. So that's when he started writing his novels. So his first novel, Molokai, was a national bestseller. His second novel was released to just wonderful acclaim. My favorite. And then his third novel, Palisades Park, is what he describes as his love story to his hometown. Is that right? A love letter to his hometown. And so with that, we welcome Brennert.
Well, thank you. Welcome, all of you. I was going to say, welcome to the last event on the Palisades Park book tour. But I actually realized it's actually sort of the first anniversary of the Palisades Park book tour. I was originally set to be here in November, and unfortunately life intervened. So I'm glad I was able to finally make it, and thank you all for your patience. As I was coming off the ramp off the 14, there was a sign that said Canyon Country this way, and the other way, Friendly Valley. Anybody here live in Friendly Valley? Okay. You got to tell your town council. It sounds too much like a town in a Twilight Zone. There are really terrible things happening. I would never make that turn. Just saying. Just saying. Anyway, one question I always ask at every event I do, and it surprises me sometimes, the results, is has anybody here ever been to Palisades Amusement Park? This is the first room where no one has raised their hand. Okay, so I have to tell you about the place then. This is a park that I grew up literally down the street from. I always lived up until the time I was 12 years old, about a mile from Palisades Amusement Park. It was built around the turn of the 20th century atop the Palisades in New Jersey, overlooking New York City, the Hudson in New York City. It started out as a trolley park, which was a park that it was designed by the transit companies to give people a reason to spend nickels on trolleys on the weekend. So they created these nice little parks where people could just walk through pleasant gardens and see the beautiful view of the Hudson. And eventually, over the next 10 years, it got a little bit more worldly. They started to bring in a balloonist. They had a merry-go-round. Eventually, they brought in real rides like roller coasters, and it just sort of got bigger and bigger. But in 1913, they did the most daring thing. Even now, I find it hard to believe that people in 1913, would have actually been able to accomplish this as well as they did. They decided they wanted to compete with the Jersey Shore, so they built a saltwater pool, which every day pumped up like 1.5 million gallons of water from the Hudson River. It went through one filter after another until it was literally clean enough to drink. And then they filled the pool with that. People swam in it. They put in an artificial wave machine, which was basically sort of a big thing in back that went boom, like that. And they put in a fake sand beach. So it really did have the feeling of being at the shore. And then at the end of the day, they would drain it. The 1.5 million gallons would go back into the Hudson River, and they would start pumping up the next 1.5 million gallons. It really was just a staggering, technical accomplishment at the time. And the owners, when first the Skink brothers and then the Rosenthal brothers had contacts in show business, so there were always acts there in addition to the rides and to the pool. In the 1960s, they capitalized on burgeoning rock and roll by bringing in people like the Supremes and the Temptations and Leslie Gore, who was a local girl. So when people ask me what Palisades Park was like, I say it was like the Jersey Shore, an amusement park, and a rock concert all rolled up in one. But for me, what I remember about Palisades is the memories of having gone there with my family, riding, the Kitty Cyclone with my dad, being in the saltwater pool, taking my first steps wading in the pool with my mother. But my favorite memory took place in 1962 when I was about 8 years old, and my mom I had to go to the hospital for a serious heart condition. It was pericarditis, and I had to stay with my aunt and uncle for about 2 weeks because my dad worked as a sheet metal operator at the Alcoa company. He worked the night shift, so he couldn't take care of me. So I stayed with Aunt Eleanor and Uncle Nick, which was like great because she was a great cook, and she took me to Palisades frequently. And we went one afternoon evening, and we passed this concession booth. And on the shelf of this concession booth, there was the biggest, most beautiful stuffed dog I'd ever seen in my life. It looked exactly, it was white, it had kind of a fuzzy, muzzle, and it looked exactly like Dennis the Menace's dog from. I wanted that dog because I never had a dog growing up. We always lived in apartments, so we couldn't have one. So, Aunt Eleanor, this was the game called the cat rack, where you throw a ball and you aim for these little fuzzy cats. And it looks easier than it is. It wasn't rigged, but it was not easy to do because if you didn't hit the cat right in the middle, it just sort of stood up straight. They were just sort of the ball whizzed through the fur. And I was 8 years old. I was no Mickey Mantle. And Eleanor slapped down dime after dime. I threw toss after toss. We must have been there for an hour. But finally, I won that dog, which I named Bruff. And the next day, we took it to the hospital. And those were the days when kids couldn't go to the hospital. You could only stand down in the parking lot while your parent came to the window. And my mom said that the nurse came and said, "Oh, Mrs. Brennert, your son is in the parking lot and he has with him the biggest dog you have ever seen." And my mother thought, "Oh God, Eleanor, what the hell have you done?" But then she saw that it was stuffed, and she was good with that. So I wanted to write a story about Palisades, but I didn't want to write it from the point of view of me as a kid because that's just a travelogue, and I really wanted to know sort of what the life of the park was. What was the story behind the story? I mean, that's, if you've read my other books, that's sort of what I'm interested in. I wanted to know the life of the average person at Kalapapa. I wanted to know what was behind the glamour days of Honolulu in the 1920s. And I wanted to know about what made this park tick. And so I did a lot of research and talked to a lot of people who worked at the park and got a real sense for that. And there was another thing that I wanted to do in this book. I wanted to use something, a part of my own family history. There's a little bit of me in all the characters, but there's a character, the main character who starts out the book is Eddie Stockman. And Eddie's kind of a nice, intelligent, working class guy in New Jersey. And I got the name from my Uncle Ed, who still is in New Jersey at 91 years old, still going strong. I send him Cheesecake Factory cards every day for Christmas, and he's always calling me up and saying, we went to the Cheesecake Factory and had that great New England clam chowder and the crab cakes. And he told me all these stories about, his experiences in World War II, where he was in the service for the entire war, and even before that, for a little while. And he never saw any combat at all. And the reason was he was mustered out 3 times as they tried to get a crew for 3 different ships. Each time they stopped before they got to him because his name started with a W. Every one of those 3 ships later were sunk. So he really was incredibly lucky, and he wound up as an aviation machinist on the island of Espiritu Santo, which was in the New Hebrides Islands, as they were called in those days. And I originally had an entire chapter in this book set on Espiritu Santo, talking about Eddie's adventures on the island. And after I handed in the final, manuscript, or near final manuscript of the book, my editor said, it's great, but, your agent and I both agree that the one thing that you can cut is the chapter on Espiritu Santo. And I was like, well, no, I can't, because the whole point is, he doesn't see any action. He quit his job in Edgewater so he could, go and join the Navy, and he winds up doing the same thing he did in the defense industry. And my editor said, we can talk about that later. I said, no, we really need to see it. So I wound up having to negotiate this, as I usually do with my editor. I wound up taking out, stuff that she considered extraneous, left it the stuff that I thought was absolutely necessary, and sort of intercut between that and Fort Lee. So it didn't take away from the story of Tony, his daughter. But there was some cool stuff in there, and as a cattle rustler. So one of these days I'll sneak that in, but for now you've gotten the DVD extra. Anyway, I would be happy to answer whatever questions you have, either about Palisades or any of my books, and if I don't have an answer, I'll try to make something up on the spot.
Got a question? Did I understand that you not only wrote novels, but you also wrote for
TV and film.
TV? So what's the difference in that?
Well, writing these scripts are they're like a play script. All you write a shot heading, you write a scene description, and then you write dialogue. Everything is told through the action and through the dialogue. There's no internal monologue like you do. There's no great descriptions because it would be wasted on the director and location manager. You just want to sort of set the scene as minimally as you can. It's also, for me at least, a lot faster than writing books. Writing these historical novels takes me a long time to research. So it took me about 2.5 years to write Palisades Park, about 3 years to write Molokai, and the average script, even if it's a mini-series, I can do in 6 months or so. So it's a lot more intensive. Each one has their own satisfaction. The satisfaction of a novel is that it's yours, basically, for better or worse. You get to do it at a pace you want without having to worry about where commercials are going to come in, or what the actor will and will not say, or what the director wants to do with it. But there's also a certain magic to the film industry when it goes right. Unfortunately, the ratio of times it goes right to times that it goes wrong is like maybe, in my experience, about 1 in 5. So eventually I just said, well, let me try writing books for a little while, which is not to say that I wouldn't go back. I actually am waiting to hear. These are the 3 historical novels I wrote, but before this I wrote some Twilight Zone-esque fantasy novels, and there is a movie studio that is interested in doing one of them, Time and Chance, as a film, and we have an offer out to a big movie star And if he says yes, we have a movie, and if he says no, we don't have a movie, and I'm writing another book.
So fame comes in different places. in
Yes,
different ways.
yes, and you can never predict where. You know, it's just that's the thing about being a writer. It's like you don't really have a lot of control over your career. It's like you do when in the writing of the book, but then you know it's left to somebody else to spend the publicity money and the marketing money and get the reviews and all the rest of that. And the same thing is true in television by and large. The sole experience, the best experience I had in television was on the revival of the Twilight Zone in the 1980s, where I got to not only write but also produce my own episodes, and that was a real satisfying experience. But as I say, 1 in 5, not great odds.
Thank you.
You've probably heard this question a million times, but what's your connection to Hawaii?
I've heard that a million times. I first became interested in Hawaii when I was a kid growing up in New Jersey, and I read a comic book called Dennis the Menace Goes to Hawaii. I was a big Dennis the Menace fan, and it was the very first comic book that was purportedly written, with where the writer and the artist went on location to research the book. They actually flew to Hawaii and took photos, and I now have background. Am I being played off? Is this like the Oscars? Better wrap it up. Anyway, they and I read this now, and I think, wow, what a sweet kid. Can you imagine that? Yeah, we could write and draw a comic book set in Hawaii, but we'd have to go there first for a research trip, I have to do it. And then they got away and they did with it. And that's what I do now with my novels. I go for what my wife refers to as research trips to Hawaii. But it was such a great comic because it was really beautifully illustrated of sites like the New Honolulu, Pearl Harbor, the Fern Grotto on Kauai, and it really filled me with a desire to someday go to this place. And in 1980, I went for the first time, and I just fell in love with it. I walked off the plane at the old Maui airport before they had jetways. We walked down a ladder onto the tarmac. And the minute I hit the tarmac, a trade wind blew in, the smell of plumeria. I took a deep breath and I just thought, I'm home. And I would love to live there, but it's not really practical. My wife's family lives far enough from her as it is. But I do have I've been going there once a year at least for the last 30 years, and I've been keeping buying a library of books on the history and the culture and mythology, not with any intent at first to really write anything. I just was interested in the culture, and the more I started reading about it, the more I thought maybe I should write a novel. And that turned into Molokai. And so it's still, I haven't been there now for a couple of years. We're hoping to actually go, if this movie does not go, then my consolation prize will be a trip to the Big Island, I think. But it's just a place where I think I always feel happiest when I'm in Hawaii.
I agree.
Great.
Congratulations on Palisades Park. I really love the book. My book club, I found you when my book club read in Molokai. And so when you have that, as your, will it ever be as good? Palisades Park is a standalone, wonderful novel. And I think something that you do really well is we really endear ourselves to your characters. You bring them out, you give them personalities that were interesting, that we want to know about. And in Palisades Park, I thought it was very brave of you to, if you ever read the book, this is, I'm going to plug your ears right now.
Spoiler alert!
Spoiler alert. But when you have the mother kind of be awful, that's a very brave way to go. Because some of us will be like, what? Are you,
Oh yeah, I've heard the complaints.
Oh, yeah.
How could she do that?
So I guess, how do you do that? How do you, because
about Adele. We felt, sympathy for her, we felt sorry for her, we hated her, we, felt a whole gamut of emotions. And that was what I intended, people to feel. I mean, she isn't a perfect character. None of them are perfect characters. I mean, Tony is really quite a brat to her mother when she's growing up. Eddie very selfishly enlists in World War II without telling his wife. So I wanted to write a book about flawed characters. She's perhaps the most flawed of them all, but I think by the end of the book you at least know where she's coming from, why she is the way she is. And interestingly enough, my editor didn't object to any of that. And I was expecting to have a little bit of a dust up with her over it, but I think she saw what I was trying to do.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
At the beginning of the book, you gave like a little story about Adele, like when she grew up, her dad was like a film director, and she was like somewhat of a movie star. And then towards the end, she left for this magician. How come you made her leave with the musician rather than like a film director who?
Well, none of the characters except Tony. Tony is the only character in the book who actually achieves the dream that she set out to achieve. And I won't spoil it for those of you who haven't read it. So, but Eddie starts out, wanting to work at Palisades, and at a certain point, that's like the best job he can think of. And at a certain point, that wears off for him. He winds up going into something else. Jack starts out thinking he's going to be an artist. He winds up being something else in a way. And the same thing with Adele. She starts out wanting to be a movie actress, and ultimately she just decides that being on stage is enough for her. It seemed unrealistic to have all of the characters achieve their dreams, so I just had Tony achieve hers, and the other ones sort of achieve it in other ways. I mean, I think that's the case with a lot of people, going into a career. There are turns along the way that you can't plot out. My wife was an editor for 17 years with the National Geographic. She worked on the Traveler magazine and on books for them and everything. She's now a senior proposal writer at a health insurance company. It's like, how did that happen? She can barely explain it herself, So I wanted to have them achieve some semblance of what they wanted, but not the whole thing.
Okay.
When you start writing a book, do you have definite ideas about where your character is going to end up, or do you start writing and then find that you change how it all resolves at some point?
I generally have an idea. When I start writing, I know what the ending is going to be. And I occasionally even know what the last line of the book is going to be. I knew what the last line of Molokai was before I started. I knew what the last line of Honolulu was. I know generally the arc of their lives, but where I wind up improvising as I go along. I plot this out in it's a leftover from my television days. I've got a big cork board, and I put up, index cards. Chapter 1, one card, 2 cards, 3 cards, 4 cards, 5. Okay, that's chapter 1. And then I'll do chapter 2. And I generally plot only about a few chapters ahead because I'm researching at the same time often that I'm writing. And I'll find stuff in the researching that I think, well, this surprises me, and might surprise readers as well. So I let it shape the plot a little bit. And I wind up taking twists that I couldn't have expected. In Molokai, when Rachel meets her daughter Ruth, she finds out that Ruth was interned, as she was in her own way. I wish I could say I was smart enough to have planned that from the beginning, but I wasn't. It was as I was developing the book, I thought, okay, she's going to marry a Japanese man now, so their daughter will be half Japanese, and I wanted to have them adopted. I knew I wanted them to move a certain distance away from Hawaii, so it wasn't too easy for her to track them down. And then it was like, okay, California, 1940, oh my God, they're being hers. So those are the moments of serendipity that sometimes happen while you're writing the book. it's part plotting and part improv. Is somebody else back there?
I have a question on the historical figures that you had in Honolulu, the detective and, I can't think of his name, the surfer, Duke.
Honolulu.
Right. And did you research them and where they would be at around the same time as your characters?
Oh yeah. I actually had a hell of a time figuring out exactly when, Duke would be in Hawaii, because at that time he was spending some time in Hollywood doing movies. He was, competing in swimming tournaments and everything. But I found a time during the summer when I knew he'd be in Hawaii. I'm that obsessive about it. And I researched him, and I read a book about him, several books about him. Read everything I could find about Changapana. There's now a full-length biography of Charlie Chan and Changapana, but there wasn't when I wrote the book. So I wound up doing a lot of primary research, as well as looking. There was a documentary about him that was on one of the Charlie Chan DVD sets. So I always try to make them as true to life as I can, while at the same time, they're fictionalized. And occasionally I'll find, in Palisades Park, I was lucky enough to find interviews with some of the concessionaires as they were being interviewed for papers. And I managed to work some of that stuff in there. So, so whenever possible, I try to keep it as accurate as I can. Mae Thompson, the details of her life are as they were in there. I didn't know that that's how she sounded. I all we had to go on were Somerset Maugham's his notebooks, and he talked about this loud prostitute who was entertaining men in the room next to his and driving him crazy. And so in that case, I just wound up, I watched the silent version of it, and then I watched the talkie version with Gloria Swanson. And I love Gloria Swanson's version so much that I said, okay, I'll use her speech patterns. So sometimes you just have to make it up.
What's next for you? Or what's next for us?
Well, like I said, if this movie goes, I'll be doing this for the rest of the year, I would hope, doing rewrites on the screenplay. And if it doesn't go, I will be depressed for about a month. No, maybe in Hawaii. Maybe that would be. If my wife's busy season weren't right now, I would, I'd say yes. Let's immediately go. But then I'll probably be working on a new novel. I have another novel. It's actually something that my agent suggested to me, and it is set in Hawaii. So it's another. It's actually part of it's in Hawaii, and part of it is somewhere else. But there's enough Hawaii in there, I think, to satisfy my fans in Hawaii.
Is it in present time Hawaii or
historical? Another historical. But that's something I'm just sort of germinating. Well, yes.
Maybe you touched on this and I missed it, but are you as emotionally wrung out after writing your books as I am of reading them?
My wife reads it chapter by chapter as I finish it, and she comes into my office crying during Molokai, going, "You have to stop killing so many people." That was the reason that I didn't show Sister Catherine's on-stage funeral. I thought, no, she's right. There are too many friggin' funerals in this book. You get wrung out at times, but because I'm writing it over a period of 3 years. It's not as intense an experience as you are when you're reading it over the course of a week or a few days or whatever.
A few days, you can't put it down.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. There are points certainly where I will get choked up as I'm writing it. Notably the scene where Rachel is being herded on the cattle boats, and her family is on the other side of the fence, and she's reaching out for one last touch and can't do it. And the scene where Kenji and Rachel have to give up their daughter. I don't have kids, but I've had pets. I have cats and dogs over the years. I love them as much as I would children, and I know what it's like to lose them, and I know what it's like to have to give one up. We had one one cat who we loved, but he was always attacking our other cat, and you know, it was heart-wrenching having to give him up. So you know, you find analogs in your own experience for when you're writing, but yeah. So fortunately I don't write these in the same amount of time that it takes you to read them. Well, maybe I should. It would be nice if I did. Certainly, I'd be making a better annual salary. I'll tell you that.
If you did a movie, what actor would you like to be in the movie?
Which of what? Which book?
If you did a movie, would you book?
Which book? Palisades Park?
Molokai.
Oh, Molokai?
What actor would you like to be?
Oh, I don't know. You know, people have asked me this in the past, and I don't really think about movies as I'm writing it. I just envision the characters. It's a little difficult for Rachel. There's very few Hawaiian, you know, full Hawaiian movie stars. I mean, Tia Carrera, you know, would make a good Rachel, an adult Rachel. Strangely enough, I've also, while somebody asked me this, I thought, well, even though she's Hispanic and she's not Hawaiian, Jennifer Lopez has sort of like the face and sort of like the steel, you know, in her that I associated with Rachel. You have to make her half Portuguese, I suppose. But I really, I don't think about that. And even after the book is done, you know, I don't spend a lot of time unless I actually have a producer who's interested and they're saying, okay, well, what should we get for this? And if somebody says, you know, comes up with a really hideous idea, well, wait a minute, maybe so-and-so might give that idea.
Do you have a favorite writer of your own who you like to read?
You know, I have a lot of favorite writers and a lot of favorite books, but it's not one single one. Well, let me think. If I had to name my favorite novel, it would be probably Daniel Keyes' Flowers for Algernon, which was made into the movie Charlie. That is the first book that I read that I think really made me cry, and really made me aware that, you know, a book can really reduce you to tears. But I also liked, you know, Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. It was one of my favorite books growing up. Les Miserables sort of imprinted itself early when I was a kid, and virtually anything Ray Bradbury ever wrote, you know, influenced me. Although my style doesn't look anything like his, you know, I love Ray's work. And contemporary writers, I enjoy Larry McMurtry and Lisa C. and Michael Chabon. I tend to not read a lot of fiction when I'm writing fiction, because I don't want any of it to sort of bleed through what I'm doing. So I get to read, you know, between books. Thank you.
Can you give a little distance from your book? Do you just let it go, or do you ever wish you could go back and, you know, insert a character or restructure a certain part of the book?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's you know, that's why I don't reread them. I only reread them if I have to, if I'm adapting it for a movie or a screen or a teleplay, or if it's being reissued. Time and Chance, I actually was reissued a few years ago. It was an experiment to see if my current readership will, you know, who reads historicals, will read a fantasy novel. The answer, by the way, is no. But I went back and I couldn't. They sent me just the, you know, a Xerox of the original book. But I started reading, going, oh God, I do this different today. I do this different today. And I wound up rewriting the whole book. Not the story. The story and the characters stay exactly the same, but the language, you know, it just flows a little bit more. For some reason, I look back at this and I go, wow, in 1990, I really liked semicolons. I performed what I call a semicolonectomy. That's out. That's out. Oh, dashes. What do I need dashes here for? Put in a comma instead, you know. So I do that on occasion. I doubt that I will do that with any of these books, but you know, catch me in 20 years, and I pick up Molokai again. Even now, you know, there are certain things where I'll flip through Molokai and I'll think, oh, I could have said that better and everything. But you know, there is a point where you have to kind of let it go, and especially if you only wrote the book 10 years ago, it's like, yeah, good enough. Good enough.
Any last questions?
So it sounds like you read as a child. At what point did you start writing or decide you wanted to be a writer?
Well, that's a funny story. I probably was about 9 or 10 years old. If I can trace it back, my earliest memory of actually writing, it really wasn't writing, it was typing, was I'd seen a cartoon show on TV the night before called Dorothy's Return to Oz. It was a primetime animated special. And the next morning, I banged out a little synopsis of it on my toy typewriter. Now, that's the first thing I can remember, but I must have had an interest in it beforehand, or I wouldn't have had a toy typewriter. But I can't remember a time when I didn't want to be a writer. Now, my father, in addition to working for the Alcoa Company, was also a writer. He wrote aviation for aviation magazines in the 1940s because he was a pilot back in the 30s. And he was a good writer. He had a clean, you know, lucid style. But he sort of wrote all the articles that he felt he, you know, wanted to write by the time I came along in '54. So I didn't grow up with a real awareness of him as a writer. So clearly I got a genetic gift from him. And also, having been a writer, you know, neither he nor my mother ever discouraged me from being a writer. They always, you know, were happy to buy me whatever weird book or comic book I wanted to read. You know, I really couldn't have had more supportive parents for being a writer, which I'm grateful.
Why did you, well, I don't know if it's why or how did you pick the Labyrinth Colony as your first book?
Well, you know, it started out, I kind of backed into it. I read a wonderful book called Consider the Senor by Harriet Dillard, which is about a group of expatriate Americans in Mexico. And it was sort of about the bonds of community in this exotic location. And I read this and I thought, you know, I'd kind of like to write something like this. And my wife and I had been to Molokai on a day trip a few years before, and it struck me as a very beautiful island, even for Hawaii, very unique, because it's a very small town Hawaii, no development, and that's exactly how the locals like it. And it struck me as the kind of place where you could get lost. If you wanted to get lost, you could get lost in this place. And so I started to think about writing a contemporary novel about people who wind up on this place, this island. The more I read about Molokai, though, the more I learned about, you know, Kalapapa. And the more I learned about Kalapapa, I realized, well, this is the ultimate story about the bonds of community. This is what I should be writing about. Because there's very, very little was written, you know, about the ordinary people who lived and died in Kalapapa. It was all about Father Damien and the caregivers, which was all well and good. But I thought, you know, well, there's another story here to be told. And so I wound up morphed into a historical novel. And it opened up a new career for me as a historical novelist, which it turns out I really enjoy doing because I really enjoy research. It takes me a long time to do. I love when I'm asked by book clubs, do you have a team of people who do the research for you? And I'm like, no, it's just me. Sorry. You know, I like doing the research, and I find things that I would not ordinarily have found just by doing it all myself. So that's how Molokai came about.
Thank you. Couple of closing words.
Okay.
We so appreciate you coming.
Okay.
And I'd like to present you with our Friends of the Library book bag.
Oh, thank you. I can use this next time I go grocery shopping.
So everyone enjoy our light refreshments, and you are good to sign some books.
Yeah, I'll go back.
And they are for sale. And then one quick thing,